We all know politics, so ephemeral. Do you know what she's doing now, though? She's writing books as well as studying and undertaking some research. And she's fixed her focus on education. So how telling that we've got her here with us today. And her book is actually, we've got copies here. I don't know if they're for sale, but you could look at it. And it's there's Tales from the Political Trenches. Well, that's your kind of gossip reading, you know, when you're in bed at night. The book we're talking about, though, is A Class Act, and she's going to talk to us today. And her talk is called A Class Act for All. And in case you don't know anything about that book, she'll tell us, but just briefly let me tell you that it is looking at schools that against the odds achieve fantastic outcomes for their students, and what is the secret to those kinds of learning communities. So let's hear from Maxine. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here with the Victorian State Secondary Principals. I know some of you in the room from visits to schools and from talks across the region, so good to be with you this morning. I'm also feeling, probably like you, still pumped by Gail's presentation, which was, you know, so high energy and high octane, wasn't it? So I've got a lot to live up to. But look, you're all full of caffeine now, so look, I'm on a roll. I have to say, with so many educators, I see these days real energy and thoughtfulness in the discussions that are underway, and we certainly saw that this morning. And of course, it's all about how we can lift performance, and not just on, as many of you have said, those traditional measures, but what it is about, of course, is providing a rich set of opportunities for all of our young people. And of course, you're showing that spirit today. But you know, when I consider the whole, and I'll come to Class Act in a moment, when I consider the whole, I'm reminded of those famous lines of Charles Dickens at the start of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. And I wonder, only a foolish country tolerates a situation where just 1 in 10 students is doing advanced maths, and where female participation is really quite low, or where 40% of lower secondary students are taught by a non-maths specialist. And let's be clear, we are in this situation because of choices we have made. The devaluing of intellectually demanding subjects such as maths has been evident for over 20 years, and yet we remain ambivalent about the planning and investment that might arrest this decline. If we need anything, we need that spirit of Lynbrook that Gail has just been talking about. Another area where I think we seem to be showing a complete deficit of wisdom is in the area of vocational training. The teenagers and the young adults, and indeed the retrenched adults, who are most in need of high-quality training and decent careers advice, are, it turns out, the ones at the moment least likely to get it. I've spent some time in recent weeks actually talking to people who've been involved in this area for decades, and it's interesting, some of the policymakers have been prepared to admit their own errors, and they are the ones who are now saying that the free-for-all that passes for post-secondary vocational training in this state is now really deserving of a full-on commission of inquiry. It's good to see, in fact, that the new minister here has called for a short, sharp inquiry, and I'm hearing that the same from the federal level from the new minister, Simon Birmingham. But while we're doing that, I think we also should be looking at VET in schools. Now, I know some of you would be players in that field. There's some excellent programs out there, but I'm also aware it's highly variable. We heard from Rick this morning about the vast chasm that exists between well-resourced schools and others. There will be no point. I mean, the key point I make about this is there needs to be content rigour. Again, to go to Gail's point, deep learning. Why should we be denying the kids that are streamed into this area the deep learning? So it's about content rigour. And there's going to be no point in building these new technical high schools that we're being promised if we end up graduating students with limited skills for a narrowing occupational base. Now, I have broken all the rules of good speech making by starting on a downbeat note. I'm sorry about that, but I've never been one to follow conventions. Class Act, the book that I've spent really the last 2 years on, is not a downbeat book, far from it. The most encouraging thing for me to hear, actually, since its publication last September, is to hear from practitioners such as yourselves and others who've read it, that what they like is the way the book honours the applied wisdom that we now see across so many schools. Now, just to give you a bit of background, I'm the classic person who keeps reinventing. You know, you've just heard journalism to politics, and now I'm at the University of Melbourne in the Graduate School of Education. And that has been a superb place to be. I've used that time to write about the challenges in our education system, and I've done that by telling stories. Now, first of all, a disclosure. Most of you have tweeted this. I am the least expert person in the room, but I don't allow that to be at all intimidating. I've already survived the most intimidating hurdle of all, and that was in satisfying the exacting standards of my 91-year-old mother. Mary taught in public schools in Queensland for 40 years. She was trained at the old Kelvin Grove College. If any of you know anything about the Queensland system, that's now part of QUT. 1 year of training, and then was sent out to the bush to teach in one-teacher schools. So when I told her I was doing this, she looked at me a bit sniffily. You know, she's still got that teacher's look. And she gave me one directive. She said, "Make sure it's readable." I can't tell you the relief when she delivered a thumbs up. And she then said she'd read it once, she was going to read it again. Funny how mothers can still make you feel about 12. So look, what I have done is listen to the experts, both practitioners, importantly, and academics. And I've used the narrative skills from my time in journalism to write a mainstream story about what I think is our biggest state and national challenge. And that's how we get more of our schools operating to the standards of our most effective schools. Now, as I say, overall, I'm an optimist. While I lament, like Rick and many others here today, this vast social segregation that now seems, I think, to be a semi-permanent feature of our schooling system, I do see, on the other hand, very, very concentrated efforts that are a response to the red lights that have been flashing in our system for some time. The point I've emphasised in Class Act is that while there's a solid understanding of what needs to be done, we're not that good at sharing knowledge and replicating success. Now, we can blame bureaucratic structures, we can blame inconsistent policies, professional indifference, and a million other things. I think more sensible is to consider what it is that works in those high-performing systems, high-performing countries, and adapt them for local circumstances. It is hard to go past, I have to say, what Singapore does. Many of you would be familiar with their National Institute of Education. It's seen as something of a gold standard when it comes to the training of teachers. But what's such a notable feature of that academy is that it's a two-way learning process between the academy and the schools. Effective practice in the schools is constantly informing teaching at the Institute, and it is done in a highly collaborative and respectful manner. Many of our own universities are starting to work in this way, and I think teachers are the better for it. Effective partnerships are being formed between, as I say, the institutions and schools. Now, the next step looks like being a regulatory one. The new chair of AITSL, the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership, Professor John Hattie, who I wonderfully get the chance to talk with, you know, a couple of times a year. We call him the Scarlet Pimpernel at MGSE because he's, you know, so hard to pin down because everyone wants a bit of his time. But in the chats I have to him, and he said this publicly as well, he is signalling far more rigour when it comes to the accrediting of teacher training courses. Now, in line with his many years of research through Visible Learning, you'd be aware of this, of course, into what constitutes effective teaching practice. Hattie, I think, is determined to develop greater commonality around what it is that are high-impact teaching methods. He is now tasked actually by the Minister, Christopher Pyne, with implementing the results of the TMAG inquiry, that Teacher Ministerial Advisory Group. And of course what that is about is AITSL requiring the universities to give them evidence of the efficacy of the programs that they're putting young teachers through. At the top of my list, I have to say, about those high-impact teaching methods, and you'll have to indulge me on this, at the top of my list is some kind of agreement around effective practice and methodology in the teaching of reading and writing. Now, we all know what that PIRLS data tells us, that we're in the middle of the OECD pack, and that as a consequence, too many of our students, and I hear this so much from principals, too many of our students are making it to high school with poor reading and writing skills. And that has a flow on to every other subject. That has a flow on to maths, because you need to understand the maths problem and the way it's written to be able to get on top of it. There's also that PIRLS-related survey material which really depresses me. When asked, 45% of Australian children say they only read if they have to. That's a miserable statistic. It's a terrible indictment, I think, of what we're putting in front of children and our collective failure to excite children about the world of discovery through reading. And that leads, I think, to an important question. It comes back to what John Hattie's now doing at AITSL. How many universities, I wonder, can confidently say that graduates from their education faculties enter the classroom with a sophisticated linguistic toolkit that can unlock the magic of English for young students? Now, certainly the political class remains unconvinced about this, and the vacuum, in part, gets filled with things like direct instruction, controversial program. One can see its easy appeal. DI's promise is a very strict, clear formula for teaching sounds and words. And for children who start school with very, very significant developmental deficits, there's evidence that it's working. But the open question is how far something like this takes us. Now, one view, and it's put by a University of Canberra academic, Dr. Misty O'Donoghue, a lecturer in language and literacy, and by the way, a winner of her university's Vice-Chancellor's Excellence in Teaching Award. I've profiled Misty in my book, and I really recommend this chapter to you. Misty's view is that this read from the script approach of DI really amounts to a surrender of a teacher's professionalism. And further, that the ambition of teachers should not be confined to the achievement of a basic level of reading proficiency, but should instead look at the multiple ways we can help children use the full repertoire of the English language. Now, Misty's methods, great name, isn't it? Misty O'Donoghue. Misty's methods, and it's interesting, she developed this practice after she started teaching English as a second language. So many teachers say this. It's when they start teaching English to children, as I say, who have no knowledge of English, this really focuses them on effective teaching practices. So, Misty's methods are based on teaching the foundations of grammar through exposure to the best of English literature. I think this can be seen as an attempt to find a space, between two extremes. On the one hand, you've got the conservatives who are nostalgic for, what they remember, which is a return to 1950s style grammar. And then on the other side, parts of the academy who really still favour, obscurantism. As Misty said when I interviewed her, she said, there's a lot of snobbery on this topic and on all sides. But when it comes to language, what she stresses is that being literate is about being a contributor. It's as simple and as important to that. And to those principals here struggling with children in low SES schools who may come to school with, and in many cases do, with such deficits in their language, you're the link. You're the link. They have to get it at school. Now, I'm singling Misty out because it seems to me she talks such good sense on this topic. And I've also seen her in action. There's great clarity about what she does and says. Late last year, she held a masterclass at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. And it was a group of mid-career professionals Many of them English teachers, primary, secondary, a lot of them doing their master's degrees. Misty began by telling a story about one of her graduates. This was a young woman teaching in her first school, and at the beginning of the year, I think it was the assistant principal got them all together and said, "Okay, right, we want to boost our NAPLAN this year. What's everybody's strategy for boosting NAPLAN?" This young woman, straight out of university, first school, says, "I intend to teach." Now, this is a bit more than a bit of just a chutzpah from a novice. The self-confidence of this young woman has everything to do with the very specific training that she received at the University of Canberra by Misty. And in a very abbreviated version, this is what Misty does in her seminars and what she does at the university with her students. She began, in this seminar that I attended, she began by expertly and tactfully explaining what many in the group thought they knew but struggled to explain. Misty put two examples of writing in front of the group. Now, one looked okay on first glance, neat writing, probably a girl, commas in the right place, only one spelling mistake. Then Misty put up the second piece of writing, and we could instantly see it was vastly superior. It was full of descriptive phrases. It instantly created a mood, and it was clear that the writer understood that verbs can carry the weight of a sentence. Misty then unpacked all of this for us, showing how the adverbial phrases were used to good effect, how the whole sentence was structured to tell an engaging story or to lead you into the story. And sentence structure, as you would know, is something that attracts top marks when it comes to NAPLAN writing assessment. Now, the revelation, when we went through this little exercise, the revelation was not just that most of us needed reminding about things like adverbial phrases, but that the superior piece of writing was the product of the younger of the two children's contributions and the work of a child in the low SES school. Misty went on to explain what should be unremarkable, that any child who is explicitly taught about sentence structure, and in particular a way that great writers use language to maximum effect, has the potential to develop as a confident writer and reader. Now, as I say, the point about all of this is not to be a bore about split infinitives or a fundamentalist, and I hate all that talk about back to basics. People should talk, forward with the fundamentals is a bit better. But it really is to address, and I think we've all got to be honest about this, it's to address the consequences of a complete absence of grammar knowledge in an entire generation, and even now in the training of teachers. When I talk about this, often it's the younger teachers who come up to me and say, "Well, thank God you've said this, because I've been Googling, grammar for dummies." Now, while there has been first-class work done by linguists in our universities, not enough has been done to translate this into effective teaching practice. By the way, just before I end on this, Misty's other heresy, she's often invited into schools, and the first thing she says, "Okay, take me to your library." She goes to the library, and she says, right, she goes through the inventory. She says, "Get rid of the dumbed-down readers. They're the ones that are foisted on schools by all those educational publishers." Instead, she says, "Give your students good books. Rich, emotionally engaging literature, and don't just save it for the bright kids who can read anyway." Now, I've concentrated on this because it's central to everything. No matter what you do these days, you are required to absorb and comprehend vast amounts of complex information, often technical information. And if our education system is not operating at a premium, I think, when it comes to teaching young people how to write and communicate effectively, then we're failing them. Of course, engineering change is a difficult and complex business. And in the book that I've written, I've decided really the best thing I could do was to look at success, to acknowledge the many efforts that are happening in schools, often in places where children come from families who are living very isolated lives. But they're in schools where there's now a relentless focus on providing the kind of education that gives children a lot of choice. So what's that look like? Well, we heard about some of the stories first thing this morning. What I've done, I've written 6 case studies. 5 of them are concentrating on what we call turnaround schools. And they're institutions that have changed their culture, lifted academic performance, and as a result are now seen in a very different light in the wider community. Many of the principals at these schools tell me that the starting point was to leave behind the idea that all you do for some of these kids is to, provide pastoral care, feel sorry for them. In the time I've got, I'll mention just some of the features that are common to all these schools. Now, leadership is critical, and you talk a lot about this in your meetings. Leadership that sets the bar high, that develops a plan, that then finds the resources to back that plan and follows through with effective implementation with the whole team. I note you're very lucky here in Victoria. You've got the VASSP Learning Institute in North Melbourne, which is really doing some fine work in this regard. The starting point is to recognise that, of course, that getting promoted to the job of principal is only the start, and that doesn't necessarily equate to effective leadership. In all the cases I've researched, leaders push and push and push. They push themselves, their staff, and the system. They test the limits of their authority all the time. Now, not because of some power trip, but because they want to address significant educational disadvantage. And this kind of leadership, of course, means that often you are unsettling the status quo. When Mark McConville took over the very troubled Toronto High School on the New South Wales Central Coast, very pretty place, only about an hour and a half north of Sydney, but it, conceals a lot of troubled communities. McConville thought he would take about 12 months to take a good look around before he started his change program. That idea went out the window in the first week, just after he'd called for a look at the learning plans for all subject areas and at the curriculum documents. This was about 7 or 8 years ago, not the last century. Well, there was almost a riot among the staff, and when McConville got to the bottom of it and got all his staff behind a closed door, he found out just how poorly organised that school was. In some of the HSC Year 12 subjects, there was no curriculum plan. What was worse, some teachers didn't even seem to be too embarrassed about that. Now, 7, 8 years on, that situation is very, very different. But you can imagine in that first year, the first 2 years, just how unpopular McConville was in taking on that huge deficit. That school now sends around 40-50% of its students to university. To start with something even more basic, the personal safety of staff and students. I spent time over in Perth at the Roseworth Primary School, and it's now quite a stunning model of integrated schooling where the health, the social and the educational needs of children and parents are met. But when the principal there started, Jeff Metcalf, and this is over a decade ago, no teaching was even possible because the place was so violent. Teachers just hunkered down. Either that or they were afraid to get out of their cars in the morning. It turns out that local families used the school to continue intra-community feuds, and for a long time this was tolerated. Well, it wasn't tolerated by Metcalf, who put his own safety at risk, at first by staring down the worst of the offenders, and then by setting new rules and enforcing them. Now, a huge help, and this is where the resourcing is critical, a huge help was a complete redesign of the school with supervised entrances and exits. So Roseworth now picks up school safety awards, but it's taken a lot of years to come again to Gales Point. Critical partnerships. This school works in conjunction with Edith Cowan University, some significant philanthropists, a lot of community bodies. And it's also taken from Metcalf very purposeful leadership. He was driven by a basic idea that the children at that school deserve a slice of normality because they're not getting it at home. A safe environment where you can start to teach and to lift performance. Excuse me. Now, that kind of leadership is always allied to a very particular ambition. All of the effective principals I've interviewed have big ambitions for their school. It's not just a bit of a tick in NAPLAN, they're big ambitions. They all repeat that much quoted line that they are trying to overcome the soft bigotry of low expectations. Time and again, what you come up against in poor schools that aren't switched on in this way, they say these kids can't cope with much, you know. Now, I'm going to embarrass her. Maria Cavuni is sitting down here. Maria heard all of that when she took on the principalship of Charles La Trobe. When she looked at an analysis of how students spent their time at the school, she found that more time was spent in PE. Yet most of the students had very poor vocabularies and very poor writing skills. When she queried these priorities, she was told, well, PE suits the kids. It didn't suit Maria, did it? So she changed the timetable, put a major emphasis on literacy at all levels and got rid of those dumbed down electives, junked the lot of them. She is interested in challenging her students, not in feeling sorry for them. A migrant herself, Maria remembers the public schools of her day when she was pushed to do a lot better. When I went there last year, and I'm very, very grateful for the time that principals allowed me to come into their schools and to make, follow-up visits. When I was there last year, I was talking to a young woman who was there doing her prac, but she has a PhD in philosophy. And what she was doing with the year 9s and 10s was taking them through the basics of Socratic dialogue. To cut a long story short, what has happened at Charles La Trobe is that attendance is up. Behaviour is not the big issue that it once was. And importantly, and this is where the public perception comes in, that school is no longer being bypassed by parents worried about the reputation of the school. And last year, Charles La Trobe's Year 12 results were really the best set of results the college has ever had. A median VCE study score of 29. The Ducks of the college got an ATAR score of 91, and 92% of the Year 12 students were offered a tertiary placement. And that's what you get when you have strategic leadership and a bucket load of ambition. Now that brings me to the third element, and I've mentioned this, rich content. Give the kids the good stuff. Where else are they going to get it? In schools that are stretching their students, in secondary schools, they are ensuring a broad range of subject offerings and doing it in the deep way that Gail referred to. And in primary schools, again, they're getting rid of the idea that you give your poorest performers these low-calibre readers. Turnaround schools are doing the reverse. We know that a child's vocabulary is one of the best predictors of success at schools. So smart schools are ensuring exactly what I mentioned that Misty O'Donoghue is doing, exposing them to rich literature. It's been interesting to see that this has been the message for a long time from the New South Wales Board of Studies. The president there, Tom Alignarius, urges teachers to reverse this practice, of giving remedial texts, often dumbed down remedial texts, to the struggling readers. He says less successful readers are often offered books that have little interest or appeal, when what they need are books that stir the emotions and are as demanding as the books offered to better readers. When students are offered access to good writers, their resistance to reading can be overcome, and they get the confidence that the books others read are not beyond them. The final feature I'm going to mention from the schools I see as successful is that they have a lot of respect for the people at the heart of the whole show, the students. Now, I know everyone says this, but you do have to be at a school that takes this really seriously, the idea of student voice, before you appreciate the point. Now, I think it was last year you heard from Kerry Dowsley at St Albans, and again, it's another of the schools that I highlight in Class Act. Again, a big school, 1,000 students from 7 to 12, and what they did, they conducted forums and surveyed the students about the school. Most students took the exercise very seriously. It turned out the students were acutely conscious of the fact that they were at the poorer end of the scale when it came to performance. They mentioned the fact that many teachers turned up late for class with no organised lesson plan, that they were rarely provided with feedback, and more often than not set homework that was never marked. Now, in the hands, I think, of someone else, this might have caused a bit of an industrial relations meltdown, but with Kerry Dowsley as principal, someone who had actually been at the school for a very long time, she managed the very difficult conversation with the faculty about the response of the students. She then did something I think that was equally brave. She went back to the students and asked them what they thought a high expectations environment would look like. Well, back came the answers. The students wanted orderly learning places, clear guidelines, and teaching of the curriculum. They didn't want to go into exams being surprised. That was a big one. Above all, they wanted specific feedback of the kind that would point them in the direction as to how they could, improve and move up to the next phase. So what is all this? This is all the stuff that's in John Hattie's book. And it was coming from the students. Now, needless to say, you can't conduct an exercise like this and not act on it. Of all of the low SES schools I've looked at, I think St Albans really has achieved the most consistent uplift in results. But again, that has not happened in 5 minutes. It's really been, I think, Kerry was saying, a 2-decade process there, and marked again by a very particular kind of leadership, a high level of collegiality, and significant ambition. And the result is huge pride in what has been achieved and a culture of constant improvement. Now, I'll just finish on this note. You can't spend time in schools these days without thinking about the world that our young people are being tipped into. No matter your qualifications, the world of work is a difficult beast to negotiate. If you go to Europe these days, it's just terrifying. It is full of highly credentialed, unemployed 20-somethings, and that's a very, very sobering and worrying sight. We know what technology is doing to jobs. But that raises, as never before, the question and the purpose of education. And I'm going to finish, in fact, it's as if Gail and I have been channeling each other, because I'm going to finish by quoting Tom Friedman from the New York Times as well. And this was a most arresting column that Tom... It's interesting, that Friedman is actually a writer on international affairs. If anyone's read his book, he's one of the best books on the Middle East. He wrote it about 20 years ago, From Beirut to Jerusalem. Stunning. But look, at some point he got switched on to all the world of high tech and looking at future trends and all the rest of it. He is very interested in certainly some of the big challenges in education in the United States, but he also looks at what's working. One of the things he did about 12 months ago, he went and interviewed the head of people operations at Google, so not far from where Gail was teaching. And he had a very specific question. He said, what are your recruitment policies? Who or what do you look for when you're hiring? Now, obviously, these places, they can get the best of the best and, the top people from the Ivy League colleges. But actually, that's not the answer that he got from this bloke at Google. He said, this is what he said: for every job, the number one thing we look for is general cognitive ability. And that's not IQ. It's learning ability. It's the ability to process on the fly, and we assess that using structured behavioural interviews that we validate to make sure that they're predictive. A couple of other things he mentioned, leadership qualities, obviously, an ability to work with teams. And another thing he said, we also look for a sense of responsibility, a sense of ownership to step in, and the humility to step back and embrace the better ideas of others. The end goal is what can we do together to problem solve. Now, if you think about this, it's all the stuff that Professor Patrick Griffin has been working on around 21st century skills. And any time you hear a politician, be it at the state or the federal level, deriding this notion of collaboration or problem solving or whatever, they are just, blowing something up there. Some things. Right, okay. To sum up, I like Friedman's conclusion on this. This is what he says. He said, so beware, your degree is not a proxy for your ability to do any job. The world only cares about and pays off on what you can do with what you know. And it doesn't care how you learnt it. I think that's rather interesting. So to conclude, I'm hoping that my little book of Class Act, which has been made possible, as I say, by such generosity and such candour from so many principals and others in the field. I'm hoping it acts as a bit of a catalyst for some different discussions about what success looks like, about how we can create, as I say, a richer set of opportunities for young people, and particularly how we can apply a more consistent policy approach to some of our most compelling national challenges. Thank you.